The infamous Batman comic book character Joker once said, "The only way to survive in this world is to live without rules," and a real young man took this quote as a guide to action. However, when some people live without rules, it can be quite dangerous for those around them. Jaime Osuna smirked and waved at the family of the woman he had killed. At that moment, the judge was sentencing him to life imprisonment for the brutal torture and murder of a 36-year-old young mother. Dressed in prison uniform with tattoos on his face, the criminal wanted everyone to know he felt no remorse. He even gave the judge a thumbs up, showing his agreement with the sentence. This was exactly what Osuna wanted, because he was tired of being part of society. Some crimes are so horrific that it becomes difficult to imagine they were committed by humans. Jaime Osuna is one of the notorious serial killers who found joy and thrills in torturing, enslaving, and taking the lives of his victims. People called him the real-life Joker and the man with 1,000 faces. Due to his numerous tattoos, including the famous Joker smile and a pentagram on his forehead, many believed that the real Joker's criminal activities in adulthood were influenced by his difficult childhood. Jaime Osuna was born in Bakersfield, California, on March 7, 1988. His mother, Michelle, was only 19 at the time, and his father was 21. The relationship between his parents could hardly be called normal. His father was very violent and often raised his hand against his pregnant wife. When Michelle was 9 months pregnant, he kicked her in the stomach so hard that it affected the baby. The young woman forgave the child's father for this incident, and they continued their relationship. But a visual reminder of that day remained for life. Little Jaime was born with a noticeable scar under his eye. Eventually, the child's father abandoned Michelle when their son was 1 year old. The young woman was left with 2 children and almost no means of survival. However, she wasn't alone for long. Michelle began dating a man named Jeff and soon married him, moving into his house with her 2 children. As it turned out, Jeff also had a son from a previous relationship. The new boyfriend needed Michelle, but not her children, and it was very noticeable how intolerant he was of the 2 foreign offspring he had to support. Jeff clearly couldn't stand either boy, but for some reason, younger Jaime got the worst of it. Once, the newlyweds were returning from fishing with the children, and little Jaime was very tired, so he started crying and being fussy. Jeff tolerated the boy's behavior for a while, but then became so angry that he turned around, opened the door, and pushed Jaime, still strapped in his car seat, out of the moving car. Michelle was horrified because she saw a truck driving right behind them. Fortunately, the seat landed vertically and didn't end up in the traffic lane. Jeff stopped the car so the mother could go back and retrieve the child from the road, but refused to take Jaime to the hospital since there were no visible injuries. According to Michelle, he wouldn't even have allowed her to do it herself. However, when Jaime grew older, doctors discovered that he had suffered minor brain damage as a result of the incident. Jaime was still very young when, for some misconduct, his stepfather tied him to a tree outside and began whipping him with a rope. This time, Michelle didn't tolerate it and called the police. This was the only time she intervened because she felt Jeff had crossed a line. Strange that the woman didn't feel this earlier when her son was thrown from a moving car. Jeff managed to untie the child, and when the police arrived, he tried to explain it away, saying it was just a joke, they were playing. But the red marks on Jaime's body told a different story. Jeff was arrested and charged with abuse, though he returned a few days later and everything started again. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. By that time, Michelle and Jeff had 2 children of their own, whom he treated completely differently, but Jeff never managed to accept his 2 stepsons. It seemed the boys irritated him more with each passing day. Once, in a fit of anger, he threw a fork at Michelle's older son. The fork didn't cause much damage, but But when the boy's grandparents found out about this, they were shocked, and fortunately for Jaime's older brother, they took him in. However, they left Jaime behind because for some reason, the grandfather also disliked his younger grandson, and the boy had to endure his stepfather's anger and abuse throughout his childhood. Michelle said that Jaime was very loving and affectionate, but others inexplicably disliked him. When the child tried to approach his mother and hug her, it would infuriate his stepfather. When Jeff would punish Jaime by not letting him eat or putting his plate on the floor like a dog's, Michelle was deeply distressed and felt sorry for her son, but she couldn't intervene because she was terrified of her husband, as she had also suffered abuse from him many times. Jeff regularly told her that if she ever tried to leave, he would punish her. One day, Michelle couldn't take it anymore, grabbed some belongings, took the children, and left the house. Her husband immediately caught up with her, beat her, and then covered her with salt to make sure she would remember the lesson for a long time. At school, Jaime was a withdrawn, unsociable child, but none of the teachers inquired about what was happening with him. No one ever asked any questions or expressed any concern about it. Over the years, the boy's resentment toward his stepfather began to manifest as hidden aggression. Jaime started abusing small animals and harming himself. When he turned 12, his grandparents had a change of heart and took him in to raise him, but it was already too late. Michelle admitted that by that time she had noticed changes in her son. He was no longer that sweet and affectionate little boy. Jaime had become completely emotionless, detached from everything happening around him, and withdrawn into himself. A few years after this, his stepfather, Jeff, died of a heart attack. In his teenage years, Jaime caused many problems for his grandparents. He joined a small street gang and began breaking the law. He was charged with petty theft, possession, and use of illegal substances, hooliganism, and numerous fights. His offenses became increasingly severe and dangerous over time. Moreover, Jaime himself began using illegal drugs at age 15. Once at school, Jaime got into a dispute with another student and stabbed him during a fight. As a result of this altercation, Jaime spent the next 4 years locked up in a juvenile detention center. Less than a year after Jaime was released, he broke the law again while still on probation. The young man ended up at a house party hosted by a mother for her 16-year-old child. A woman named Jane thought it would be better for her son to have fun at home under her supervision than wandering the night streets with intoxicated teenagers. A supervised house party guaranteed her child's safety. Previously, Jane had worked as a prison nurse and psychotherapist. Once she was brutally attacked by an inmate at the facility where she worked, after which she changed professions. Jane fully funded the party, bought drinks, prepared snacks, and started having fun with the teenagers. She drank a bit too much and began dancing with one of the teenagers. Her nephew didn't like the woman's behavior and persuaded Jaime, who was standing nearby, to deal with the guy. Jaime didn't need much convincing. He went to the kitchen, got a knife, and stabbed the teenager who was dancing with Jane. The wound wasn't serious, but it led to another arrest for violating probation conditions. It turned out Jaime had his own motives for stopping the dancing, as he had taken an immediate liking to the woman. After the house party incident, Jaime was immediately sent back to prison, but he and Jane maintained constant communication. They wrote to each other almost daily and often talked on the phone. They called themselves good friends, friends with a 17-year age difference. Jane explained that Jaime was very intelligent, and she enjoyed talking with him. She described him as a gentleman who loved discussing philosophy and psychology, and additionally, he was very charming and captivated Jane with his masculine beauty. When his release date approached, she didn't hesitate to drive to the prison to meet him. During his time in prison, Jaime had gotten several tattoos, including the Joker's smile on his face. He was already an interesting person to Jane, and the tattoo added a certain mysteriousness and uniqueness to him. The young woman said she never took the guy seriously. She just had fun with him. After his release from prison, they immediately went to a motel, paid for the night, and spent time together as two adults. A couple of weeks later, Jane found out she was pregnant. She hadn't considered Jaime as a potential father at all, especially after he got facial tattoos, but Jaime was actually in love with Jane, and this made the woman reconsider her views. She decided that maybe Jaime would make a decent father, and that she needed to try looking at him from a different perspective. This was Jane's fourth child, and it was in her interest to try to settle down, take this young man seriously, and give him a chance. When Jaime proposed to his beloved, she accepted. In February 2010, the newlyweds exchanged wedding vows. Jaime was 22 years old, and his bride was 39. Despite the age difference, the young man was very excited and happy. He was involved in the wedding preparations and dreamed of becoming a father soon. However, just days after the wedding, Jane began to notice why her husband associated himself with the Joker. She saw another side of this man. The sweet young man would transform, as if by flipping a switch, into a jealous and controlling husband who abused Jane both physically and emotionally throughout her pregnancy. He behaved exactly like the men in his own mother's life. About 6 months later, the Osunas had such a severe argument that Jaime grabbed the urn containing Jane's father's ashes and left the house. It was very important for the pregnant woman to get the urn back. She tried calling him, but it was useless. In desperation, Jane called the police, which resulted in Jaime landing back in prison. Unfortunately, her father's ashes were never found, and Jaime spent the next 6 months behind bars before being released on parole. Naturally, by that time, Jane had already given birth to their son. Somehow, the convicted man managed to convince his wife to give him a chance to become a good father and model family man. He remembered his childhood and wanted his child to experience something different. Jaime assured Jane that he had changed and things would be different now. But people rarely change, and all the changes in Jaime's character were negative. He returned to using illegal substances, which only intensified his aggressive outbursts toward his wife. Jaime sought reactions to his actions, but Jane, knowing what her husband was trying to achieve, learned to simply ignore him. She essentially stopped acknowledging what he was saying, though sometimes she still had to stand up to him. One evening, her husband literally went berserk. He smashed a photo frame, grabbed a piece of glass, and cut his arm. The cut was deep, and Jane was frightened, especially when she realized he had cut a vein. However, Jaime acted like a madman. He grabbed some tape, wrapped the wound, and pulled a black sock over it. He absolutely refused to go to the hospital. Another evening, her husband again started expressing his dissatisfaction with his wife, while she simply ignored his words, focusing on her maternal duties. To get Jane's attention, Jaime approached the bed where her 7-year-old son from a previous relationship was sleeping, and looking his wife straight in the eyes, simply pushed him onto the parquet floor. Jane, unlike Jaime's mother, wasn't going to let her children be hurt. She went to the kitchen, grabbed 2 knives, and threw them right at her husband. Naturally, Jaime didn't expect such a reaction. He left and did something foolish that violated his parole conditions, resulting in him being behind bars again. Jaime was released on Halloween 2011. By then, his face was completely covered in Joker-like tattoos, and when everyone else took off their scary masks after the holiday, Jaime didn't have that option. His mask was permanent. The man had no intention of calming down and resumed stalking his wife, threatening her with violence, scaring her by saying he would take the children, and lurking outside her house windows. Jane had to call the police almost every day. Since Jaime wasn't taking any specific actions, officers stopped responding to the woman's requests. But one day everything changed. Jane immediately understood this from Jaime's tone. Her husband wasn't just threatening to come over. He told her to watch the news because he had taken the life of a woman at the El Morocco motel. This was on November 8, 2011. Jane called the police again, knowing her husband was capable of committing a crime. She explained to the dispatcher that Jaime Osuna was a real psycho and that he had talked about some woman he allegedly killed in a motel room. She asked them to verify the information, worried that the victim might need help, but the police took no action, considering it another provocation from Jane's unstable husband. 5 days after the phone conversation with Jaime, Jane turned on the news and saw a report that an employee at the El Morocco Motel had discovered a woman's body in one of the rooms. The victim was 36-year-old Yvette Pina, a mother of 6 children. She was a Sunday school teacher, but had recently become addicted to illegal substances and was struggling hard to fight the harmful dependency. Yvette Pina's childhood was no less difficult than Jaime Osuna's. Her mother gave birth to her at 15 when she was still essentially a child herself. As Yvette grew up, she had to take on the responsibilities of running the household and caring for her younger sister Danielle, who suffered from a congenital illness. Their mother was always working and spending time with her boyfriend, only appearing at home in the evenings. Due to such negligent treatment from their closest relative, both girls were abused by their mother's boyfriend, but even this didn't make the woman think about her daughter's well-being. She didn't believe Yvette's words, deciding that she just wanted attention. Yvette couldn't cope with the traumatic experience. She started drinking alcohol to bury her pain deeper. By age 16, Yvette had given birth to a son. At first, everything went well, and she had several more children, but in 2004, she began using psychostimulants, and her life went downhill. Yvette lost custody of her children. In 2011, Yvette was arrested for possession of illegal substances and gave birth to her 6th child while in prison. The baby was immediately taken away, which was another devastating blow for the woman. So Yvette turned to her sister for help. Younger sister Danielle posted bail for her. After being released, Yvette did everything possible to get her child back. The baby was in intensive care, and Yvette visited the hospital every day to see him. She stayed clean for several months, but one day she was told that the child was going to be adopted, and this news left Yvette in shock. She relapsed and now spent most of her time at the El Morocco Motel because she couldn't afford to rent a house. Then, on November 13, 2011, Danielle received news that her sister had been found dead in a motel room. Due to the severity of the wounds, and because the body had been in the room for several days after death, it was decided to cremate Yvette Pina. The relatives couldn't bear to see her tortured remains. According to experts, the woman had been lying there for about 5 days. The coroner determined that Yvette died from blunt force trauma and asphyxiation, and prosecutors described what the perpetrator did to her as something truly horrific, refusing to go into detailed descriptions. That's when the police became interested in Jane's call. They spoke again with Jane, who told them about her deranged husband's phone call. When Jaime was brought in for questioning after being arrested at his grandparents' house, the man denied everything. According to him, if he had said something like that to Jane, it was only to scare her. Then Jaime started accusing his wife, trying to undermine her credibility. He questioned Jane's choice to marry him. The man asked the officers why an adult woman would marry someone like him, and then claimed that his wife was crazy and wanted to frame him. Jaime kept talking about his wife for a long time. The investigators listening to his monologue noticed one thing: Yvette Pina strongly resembled Jane, and when the arrested man was pointed to this fact, he confirmed that the women did indeed look similar. Could this have been the main motive for the crime? It's possible that Jaime decided to take out his feelings and contempt for Jane Osuna on a similar-looking woman. After this suggestion, Jaime refused to talk to the police anymore. He was taken into custody and placed in the county jail, but even from prison, Jaime continued to stalk Jane. He called Child Protective Services several times, trying to get her children taken away. When she blocked his number, he started harassing her through acquaintances. Once, Jaime sent his wife a package containing a dead rat in the mail. The man always told Jane that his imprisonment didn't mean she was safe. One time, He was caught attempting to organize an attack on his own wife from prison when they intercepted a letter to another inmate. The letter contained Jane's address and instructions on how to get rid of her. At some point, Mrs. Jane did end up behind bars after her son told someone that his mom had hit him. It's unknown whether this actually happened or if the father somehow convinced his son to tell a lie. When Jane was being transported to court in a prison bus, she was attacked by another inmate. It later turned out that Jaime had convinced a Latin American woman to commit the crime against his wife in exchange for illegal substances. The guards barely managed to separate the women before either of them got hurt. The charges against Jane were eventually dropped, and she regained custody of her youngest child, Jaime's son. However, this affected her other children who were given to their biological fathers. So, he did manage to ruin his wife's life to some extent. While in jail awaiting trial, Jaime admitted that he had indeed seen Yvette on November 13th, but she was alive, and he didn't know what happened to her after that. Jaime publicly expressed hope that Yvette's family would soon find the real villain. He didn't admit his guilt even after being told that by November 13th, Yvette Pena had already been dead for 5 days, and consequently, he couldn't have possibly seen her. But Jaime stood his ground. Jaime explained that people came to this motel to buy and use illegal substances, and that the rooms at El Morocco were used for intimate services. The man even gave authorities the names of other people who were there and might have had something to do with Yvette's death. Jaime was denied release on bail, so he remained behind bars. His trial was postponed so many times that he ended up spending 6 years in prison without a sentence. The trial date was set for March 27, 2017, but before that, on March 24th, Jaime gave an interview to a journalist, shocking her with his candor. By that time, his entire face was covered in tattoos, and Jaime looked like a real villain, which in fact he was. Jaime called himself the Joker and the man with 1,000 faces. He constantly added new tattoos, making him almost unrecognizable. Each new tattoo changed his appearance, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. The difference between how he looked now and how he looked 10 years ago was striking. The female reporter sat just a few steps away from the criminal and couldn't take her eyes off his face. She listened as Jaime told her horrifying details about what he did to Yvette Pena at the El Morocco motel. The journalist said the information was so disturbing that she chose not to disclose it, as she didn't want the victim's family to live with the pain of knowing about it. Jaime admitted he was guilty of everything he was accused of. He enjoyed what he experienced while taking the woman's life. If given the opportunity, he would do it again without hesitation, and if he were ever released, he would commit another crime and take someone else's life. Jaime compared killing to a high, to illegal substances, to an addiction. He said he would prefer to kill someone rather than spend a night with the most beautiful woman in the world. Jaime also confessed to the journalist that Yvette Pena wasn't his first victim. There were a couple more people who suffered at his hands, but since he cleaned the crime scenes well, no one would ever be able to connect these victims to him. In Yvette's case, Jaime deliberately left his fingerprints and DNA at the crime scene that could lead to him. This was his plan. Jaime wanted to be caught because he no longer wanted to be part of society. The inmate didn't mind spending the rest of his days in prison. The only thing he feared was the death penalty, but he had thought this through. His plan included appearing in court, changing his guilty plea, and using the 2 other crimes that the police didn't know about as leverage. This could guarantee that he wouldn't receive a death sentence. The reporter tried to get more information from the inmate about the 2 other crimes, but Jaime only briefly mentioned that one victim was a 27-year-old man whom he killed while still a teenager. The second was a 32-year-old woman whom Jaime encountered when he was 18. When asked about any remorse, Jaime laughed and said he regretted nothing. This man didn't consider himself a monster. He just wasn't afraid to indulge his own desires without letting society influence him. Jaime believed he made himself who he was and fully understood the consequences awaiting him, but had no regrets. Jaime emphasized that he would take the plea deal not to spare Yvette's family from a longer trial where disturbing photos would be shown. He simply preferred to go to prison rather than wait several more years for trial. After this interview, the reporter took a long time to process everything. She didn't know what the right thing to do was, whether to take the information from Jaime to the prosecutor or let events unfold naturally. Eventually, she decided to wait for the trial and see what would happen. As promised, during the trial, to avoid the death penalty, Jaime pleaded guilty. His plan worked. Because of this, the family didn't have to see shocking photos of Yvette's body or hear the horrific details of how she died. The prosecutor had to accept this and agreed that it would be difficult for the relatives to hear all these horrors. Yvette Pena's sister asked the judge to schedule the sentencing for May 15, 2017. This would have been Yvette's birthday. She would have turned 42 if she hadn't crossed paths with Jaime. Neither the judge nor lawyers from either side objected, so on that day, Jaime was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Yvette's family members were in the courtroom when Jaime appeared before the court. He smiled broadly at them and waved. At the time, everyone present considered this mockery of the victim's family. During his detention at the State Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, Jaime often wrote things in blood on his cell walls. Later, Jaime was transferred to Corcoran State Prison in California. There, the 31-year-old criminal was classified as extremely dangerous and prone to violence, and they tried to keep him in solitary confinement. However, Jaime managed to break into a neighboring cell and slash another inmate's face. The attack resulted in 67 stitches for the victim. On March 9, 2019, 2 years after his conviction, the real Joker made national headlines again after brutally killing his cellmate, an inmate named Luis Romero. The 44-year-old Romero had been convicted for participating in a killing. As a teenager, he was a member of a gang that participated in an attack that ended in death. Romero had spent 27 years in prison and was soon to be released on parole. For some reason, the man was placed in the cell where Jaime lived, and a couple of days after the transfer, he was found decapitated and disemboweled. Jaime hung body parts on the cell walls as grotesque decorations. For the killing, Jaime used a safety razor blade that he had fashioned into a knife. He cut out Romero's eye, severed a finger, ripped out several ribs and a piece of lung, then decapitated his cellmate and cut his mouth from ear to ear with the blade, creating the notorious Joker smile. He took several photos of the mutilated body, which were later confiscated. When guards came for morning check, Jaime appeared before them, wearing a necklace made from rope, with a part of Romero's body hanging as a pendant. Jaime's motive was completely unclear. There were no conflicts between these two inmates. They had lived in the same cell for about 2 days. Jaime Osuna was known as a very unpredictable and violent person. He was classified as an extremely dangerous inmate, which is why Romero's family was very upset about the fact that right before his release, Romero was placed with a murderer. Many facility workers were genuinely afraid of Jaime, and other inmates called him insane. Jaime's file stated that he should have limited contact with other inmates and prison staff. He was always kept in solitary confinement, and before Luis Romero, Jaime had never had cellmates because of how dangerous he was considered to be. Jaime was transferred to Stockton Prison for inmates requiring medical or psychiatric care. In March 2021, Jaime was deemed incompetent and unable to be held responsible for his actions. Since then, he has been diagnosed with a schizophrenia spectrum disorder. Jaime's former wife, Jane, divorced him. She had to undergo multiple courses of psychotherapy after losing custody of her children and the destructive relationship with Jaime. Jane often questions why her husband directed his anger and aggression at Yvette Pena, a woman who had many similarities to herself. She felt enormous guilt toward the children who lost their mother in such a horrible way. Mrs. Jane knew that it was she whom Jaime felt hostility toward and wanted to harm in the same way, but for some reason, he hurt someone else instead. Now the woman is doing everything possible to move forward. She doesn't want herself or her son to be associated in any way with the real Joker. Jane is tired of media attention and wants a quiet, peaceful life. Recently, Jaime Osuna has been experiencing increased paranoia but refuses to take medication, leave his cell, or talk with a psychiatrist. He constantly talks about some fear that people are setting him up and complains about this incessantly. A solitary woman vanished in her own house. The perpetrator who took her life was soon apprehended. However, he insisted that he had left the body inside. So what happened to Gloria Gary? One day, a young man in a red Honda was driving along a rural highway in northern Utah. Noticing his gas tank was nearly empty, he pulled over to the shoulder and turned off the engine. No gas station was visible in the area, and he had no cash to pay for fuel. So the youth just sat in the car, contemplating his next move. At that time, another vehicle was traveling in the opposite lane. The driver noticed that the Honda wasn't moving. He figured something might be wrong with the driver, since the location was quite isolated. There were no residential houses nearby, just fields and farms. The man didn't dare approach to find out the reason for stopping in such a remote area himself. He dialed the police station and reported the red Honda parked on the edge of the rural road. He hoped that patrol officers would check the vehicle and provide necessary assistance to the driver if needed. The officer dispatched to the call indeed found the vehicle parked on the shoulder. He immediately called the dispatcher and read out the license plate numbers to get information about the car's owner, which was standard procedure. Then the officer stepped out of his patrol car and walked unhurriedly toward the red Honda. At that same moment, the door of the car stationed at the roadside opened and a young man emerged with an empty gas can. Though the guy was legally an adult, he looked incredibly young for his age. When the patrol officer asked what happened, the youth explained that he had run out of gas and had no money to refuel. So he had been sitting inside, waiting for some vehicle to appear and share fuel with him for free. While the officer was talking with the guy, a radio message came through stating that the red Honda with those plate numbers belonged to a missing person. This person wasn't the young man behind the wheel at all, but rather a 49-year-old woman named Gloria Gary. A report about her disappearance had been filed by relatives several days earlier in a completely different state. The young man was brought to the police station to answer a few questions. He turned out to be 22-year-old Kyle Alexander Jepson. During the conversation with him, officers learned that Gloria hadn't actually disappeared. She was still in her own house. But how could that be possible if relatives had searched all the rooms and utility spaces but hadn't found the owner? On January 5, 2017, Gloria Gary was reported missing because no one had seen her for several days. On January 3rd, the woman left work around 1 in the afternoon. She stopped at a local pizzeria, had a meal, and took a pizza to go. Then she got into her red Honda and drove home. After that, she vanished. Gary worked as an IT analyst at a company located in Urbandale. When she didn't show up for work the next day on January 4th and didn't call to notify about her absence, her colleagues weren't initially worried. At first, they thought Gloria had overslept for once and even joked about it. But by the end of the day, the employee still hadn't appeared, and this stirred an odd sense of foreboding. That evening, Gloria had arranged to have dinner with her father and sister, but she never showed up at the appointed time and didn't answer phone calls. Relatives assumed her plans had unexpectedly changed, which could happen. But not calling to inform them she wouldn't make it to the meeting was unlike the punctual and responsible Gloria. When Gary failed to show up at her workplace again on January 5th, her employer contacted one of her sisters to finally find out what had happened and where his employee had disappeared to. It turned out that over these 2 days, Gloria hadn't communicated with anyone she knew, not family, friends, or colleagues. The solitary woman's relatives became immediately concerned because they knew Gloria as a highly predictable, organized, and responsible person. She did live alone, had no children, and her entire life followed a pre-planned schedule. Several nights a week she would dine at her father's house, and other evenings she spent with friends at the pizzeria, never breaking this established routine without serious reason. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. If Gloria had suddenly fallen ill or encountered an emergency, she would have certainly contacted one of her relatives to let them know. But ultimately, the woman hadn't informed anyone about leaving. All incoming calls to her phone were forwarded to voicemail, and her loved one's concern gradually turned to panic. The Gary family consisted of a father, 2 sisters, and a brother. Each of them already had their own families. The nieces and nephews adored Aunt Gloria for her good-natured personality. Neighbors referred to her very politely as the woman with the gentle voice. This modest, quiet, non-confrontational lady had never been involved in any scandal. Gloria always made sure not to cause trouble for other people. Her entire life revolved around romance novels and mystery books, which she bought in bulk. Gloria dedicated her free time to reading. It would be hard to find a more unobtrusive neighbor in the area. Though, judging by her car's bright color, serious passions must have stirred in Gloria's soul. But hardly anyone would have guessed that. When she suddenly disappeared, her brother-in-law, one of her sister's husband, took on the role of family representative. At his wife's request, the man contacted the police and reported Gloria's disappearance. He explained to law enforcement that this had never happened before, Gloria leaving somewhere without notifying relatives. The sisters searched her house hoping to find an explanation for the strange behavior, but they found nothing. Gloria's car, the red Honda, was also missing. The family sensed that something terrible had happened to Gloria. That same day, the woman was declared missing. Police released a statement asking the public to remain vigilant and report any information related to the disappearance of the 49-year-old Des Moines, Iowa resident. In the alert, Gloria was described as a white woman with black hair and brown eyes, 5 feet 5 inches tall, and weighing 110 pounds. She wore thin-framed glasses. She was last seen wearing a long, dark sweater and pants. A description of her vehicle was also provided. Meanwhile, the Gary family wasn't sitting idle. Although they had no idea where to start searching, they decided to pursue all possible avenues. They turned to social media, mass media, distributed flyers with Gloria's photo, and even created a special account where people who didn't want to deal with police for whatever reason could write. The relatives did everything that might lead to any result, but deep down, they were already prepared for the worst possible outcome. Thanks to Gloria's car being a bright color, it was easy to spot among large amounts of traffic. And after just a few days, the red Honda appeared in southern Utah in a place called Parowan. At approximately 12:45, a local police officer and partner were patrolling the streets in their service vehicle. Passing by a 24-hour store, they noticed the bright car. After recording the license plate and sending the information to dispatch, the officers continued on. When they received the report that the red Honda was registered to a missing person, the officers immediately turned around and rushed back to the convenience store. Unfortunately, the wanted vehicle was no longer in the parking lot. However, the patrol officers managed to review the store's surveillance camera footage and identify the suspect who was driving Gloria's car based on the time interval. Authorities isolated several clearer images and posted them on social media with a caption stating this person was wanted in connection with Gloria Gary's disappearance. The description indicated he was an adult white male with distinctive marks on his arm that resembled either a glove, a tattoo, or some combination of both. Due to video quality, it wasn't possible to determine more precisely what it was. When Gloria's relatives saw the man's photograph, they couldn't understand who this person was to their sister. But what upset them even more was that the woman herself wasn't anywhere nearby, and she had no acquaintances in Utah. Therefore, there was no reason for her to be there. It appeared the young man had stolen the car. So where could she have gone? Worry and panic increasingly gripped the Gary family. However, the anxiety didn't last long. The very next day, January 12, 2017, an arrest was made after the hapless car thief was caught by patrol officers on a rural roadside when the guy simply ran out of gas. A random witness driving past the red Honda in his truck noticed the car and called the police, showing vigilance. The officer arriving at the scene noticed from a distance that condensation had formed on the car's windows, as if someone had been there for a while. Part of the red body had been painted black with spray paint, and the passenger window was broken and covered with orange-silver duct tape. The officer first radioed the dispatcher the license plate number of the suspicious vehicle, only then went to check who was inside. Just at that moment, the young driver exited the vehicle with a gas can in hand. Apparently, he noticed the patrol car and decided to get ahead of events, hoping the officer wouldn't notice the license plates of the stolen Honda. The guy's hands were stained with black paint. Evidently, he had planned to change the bright body color to something more neutral, but this already looked suspicious. The youth tried to distract the officer with some ridiculous nonsense about running out of gas and having no money, but the policeman approached the vehicle and inquired about what happened to the passenger side window. The guy explained it was broken, so he covered it with tape. When the officer asked how that happened, the young man told an even wilder story about sitting in the car in a bad mood with a machete. Getting totally worked up, he claimed he started swinging the knife, trying to hack at the dashboard, but instead broke the window. This story was hardly truthful. More likely, the youth said the first thing that came to mind. He assured the officer he was now unarmed. As a precaution, the policeman searched the guy to confirm he indeed had no weapons. Then he placed him in the back of the patrol car and took him to the station for questioning, because right at that time, a radio message came through that the red Honda with those plate numbers was registered to a missing woman from Des Moines, Iowa. The officer asked who owned the Honda, and the young man explained it was his aunt's car, but for some reason he couldn't remember his aunt's name. And when he realized lying was pointless, the youth admitted he stole the vehicle. He honestly told how he had taken the car that was parked in a driveway of one of the houses in Des Moines. Later, Utah state investigators obtained a warrant to search the Honda that the thief had been driving. Inside, they found numerous items indicating the youth was planning to spend some time on the road. In the vehicle, law enforcement officers discovered a small camping tent, 3 toothbrushes, men's clothing, 9 pairs of socks, a blanket, a large set of brushes, 6 spray paint cans, duct tape, and a tarp removed from the outside of the passenger door. When detectives learned the name of the 22-year-old thief and read him his rights, he changed his mind several times about wanting an attorney. First, the guy agreed to talk without a lawyer, then stated he wouldn't say a word. It was noticeable that he was nervous, and, as it turned out, there was a reason. In Iowa, a warrant had been issued for Kyle Alexander Jepson's arrest for burglary. Kyle himself claimed he was hearing about this for the first time, though that's not surprising, considering he had left the state on the run. The officer who arrested Kyle decided to proceed cautiously and casually tried to find out if the young man had seen the red Honda's owner, Miss Gloria Gary, because a report had been filed about her disappearance several days ago. Kyle's response shocked the police officer to his core. He never expected to hear such a confession. Kyle said he had indeed seen Gloria Gary in her own home, then suddenly fell silent again and refused to answer questions. Kyle admitted this was his first arrest, so he didn't know how to properly behave and what he should say versus what he should keep quiet about. Finally, the guy collected his thoughts and told the officer that Gloria remained at home, or more precisely, her dead body was still in one of the rooms because he had taken her life. The police officer from Utah, who had come in response to a call simply to check a vehicle parked on the shoulder of a rural road, never expected to have in his custody a perpetrator suspected of committing a serious crime. Looking at Kyle, honestly, he couldn't even imagine that this kid was capable of such a horrible act. The officer who brought the guy to the police station immediately called his colleagues, detectives from Des Moines, who were investigating Gloria Gary's disappearance. When Kyle Jepson was brought in for questioning, he gave a full confession, and his confession was terrible because of how random this killing had been. The young man told investigators that he hadn't planned to take anyone's life that day. He hadn't chosen Gloria or her house in advance. On January 3rd, 2017, Kyle was walking down the street in the Merle Hay area when he got the idea to break into one of the private homes. The guy chose a random building, not knowing why himself. He broke in and started waiting for the homeowners to arrive. He had no idea who lived there or whom he would encounter. At that moment, Kyle didn't even consider that some big guy could walk through the door and knock him out with one punch. He just hid and waited. When Gloria returned home carrying a pizza box, she couldn't have imagined someone was in the house. Kyle jumped out from around the corner, attacked the woman, and knocked her to the floor. Wrapping his hands around her neck, he squeezed his fingers with all his might and held on until she lost consciousness and went quiet. At first, the youth thought she had fainted, then realized the woman wasn't breathing. After making sure Gloria would never regain consciousness, Kyle violated her body. According to Kyle, during the crime, he had a sensation that it wasn't him. The guy sort of watched his actions from the outside, but he enjoyed feeling that everything was under his control. At that moment, reason seemed to leave him, and everything felt unreal. After committing the horrible crime, Kyle Jepson didn't flee the scene. He understood that he had broken the law, but thought imprisonment was too harsh a punishment for him and decided to think over his next moves. Not knowing what to do, the guy just hung around Gloria's house for a while. He took a shower, watched TV, played games on the owner's phone, browsed through books lying around everywhere, and then sent loads of messages and photos on Snapchat to all his friends. According to Kyle, some of his friends showed concern in response, though it's unknown whether he told them what he had done or if there was something disturbing in the sent photos. Perhaps they were just worried about where their friend had disappeared to. Kyle didn't mention this. For some time, Kyle remained in Gloria's house. He stole $200, a mobile phone, and the red Honda from her, before heading off to travel to another state. Naturally, after such a confession, the young man was immediately arrested and placed in the Tuel County Detention Center, Utah, where he awaited extradition to Iowa. However, one question remained unclear. If Kyle had taken Gloria's life and said he left her body in the house, where was it? The Gary relatives had entered her residence several times, inspected the rooms, but found nothing. After this, the family reported her missing. Moreover, they had invited police there when the investigation began. Detectives had indeed visited the missing woman's house and examined the rooms. Unfortunately, they didn't have a search warrant at the time, so they were limited to walking through the premises. Due to certain legal restrictions, detectives couldn't open doors, climb into the attic, or descend to the basement and check closets, drawers, or anything else. They only visually inspected the space with permission from the missing person's relatives. No one had seen Gloria for 9 days, but Kyle insisted he had left the body inside the residence. Authorities were doing everything possible to make progress in this case. Now that Kyle's confession had been obtained, they could get a warrant to legally enter Gloria's house and conduct a thorough search. When all the legal formalities were completed, detectives returned to missing Gloria's residence and began examining room by room, the attic and basement. As it turned out later, the solitary woman suffered from something like a hoarding disorder, so conducting the search wasn't easy, and the police did indeed find a dead body. To finally confirm that it was actually the homeowner Gloria Gary before them, the remains were sent for autopsy. The examination confirmed the family's worst premonitions. The authorities did not release information about why the body wasn't discovered earlier. They simply said she was well hidden in the house because the living conditions were not quite ordinary. Apparently, detectives considered the details of the dead body's location an invasion of privacy and declined to comment on it. Des Moines, meaning City of Monks in translation, is Iowa's commercial and financial center, as well as the state's main transportation hub. The city has a population of slightly over 200,000 people. Until 2017, Des Moines was considered a fairly safe place to live, but then everything changed. In 2017, a wave of crimes hit the city. Just on the first day of the year, 3 fatal incidents were recorded. Over 12 months, there was a record high number of attacks ending in local citizens' deaths. Residents couldn't remember such a high amount of crime since 1978. Of course, shootings and stabbings had occurred in Des Moines before, but the neighborhood where Gloria Gary lived was considered safe. This story destroyed the peaceful and cozy atmosphere of Merle Hay residents, forcing them to install security systems in their homes. The blame lay with 22-year-old Kyle Jepson. As it turned out, 5 days before the attack on Gloria, on December 29, 2016, the young man broke into the house of Alicia Taylor, another woman residing on Hall Comp Avenue. According to the police report, when the homeowner returned from work around 8:30 in the evening, she discovered a young man in her kitchen. He was wearing her undergarments, a bra and panties, and had pulled a woman's wig over his head. The uninvited guest had eaten the dinner Alicia had prepared earlier and consumed the remaining wine that had been in the refrigerator. Naturally, Alicia was terrified. She never expected to see a half-naked youth in women's clothing in her kitchen. However, the homeowner didn't lose her composure and chose not to display her fear to the peculiar intruder. She angrily shouted for him to get out and never return. To Alicia's astonishment, the eccentric young man complied. He quickly changed back into his own clothes, dropped the women's garments on the floor, and fled. Shortly after, the woman recognized the burglar as her neighbor's son, Kyle Jepson. She glanced out the window when the perpetrator pulled off the wig. Taylor immediately called the police and filed a report about the unlawful entry into her residence. Although the young man hadn't stolen anything, Alicia noticed that her lighter fluid had been moved. The woman had heard about frequent reports of house fires in this neighborhood lately, so she wanted to protect herself and her family from the strange neighbor. Police issued an arrest warrant for Kyle Jepson on breaking and entering charges, but they were unable to locate him. Apparently, after this incident, he had already started hiding from officers. After some time, Alicia moved out of state with her children, partly because they were afraid to stay in their house in Des Moines, especially after learning about Gloria Gary's death, which occurred several days after the attack on their home. Following the discovery of the missing woman's body, Kyle Alexander Jepson was charged with first-degree felony, robbery, and burglary. Prior to this, he had already been charged with second-degree burglary in connection with the break-in at Alicia's home in December 2016, resulting in a cash bail set at $1 million. This case involved 2 tragedies. The first was the terrible death of Gloria Gary, a woman who lived a quiet, modest life and had no enemies. The second was parents losing their son. It's impossible to even imagine what they had to go through. What is it like to be a father or mother in such a situation? To one day learn that your son, your child who grew up before your eyes, the child whose achievements you were prouder of than anything else in the world, the child for whom you would have given your life, took that life from another. And afterward, to question for the rest of your days what you did wrong. Why did your sweet angel transform into a soulless monster. So at what point did these horrific thoughts about harming a woman take root in his mind? For some time, Kyle worked at a pub just 10 minutes away from his future victim, Gloria Gary's home. His employer praised him for his efforts. Kyle developed friendly relationships with his co-workers. Many noticed that after quitting, the young man became somewhat withdrawn, distanced himself from friends, and then completely vanished from sight. When the missing woman's relatives were distributing flyers with her photograph, they asked the pub staff where Kyle used to work to place the picture somewhere visible. One of the servers attached it to the window glass. Subsequently, this seemingly ordinary situation shocked several people. First, Gloria's family, when they learned that the criminal who took their loved one's life had worked at this pub. Then the establishment's employees, when they discovered that the woman whose photo hung in the window had been killed by their former colleague. Until the very end, they couldn't believe Kyle could do something like this. In September 2017, Kyle Jepson entered into a plea agreement. This took about a month because the crimes against Alicia Taylor and Gloria Gary had an intimate motive. Gloria's elderly father refused to attend the court hearing, as he didn't want to be in the same room with the person who senselessly took his daughter's life. After all the legal proceedings, Kyle Alexander Jepson pleaded guilty to the attack on Gloria Gary and was sentenced to a maximum prison term of 50 years. Additionally, he received 10 extra years for burglary charges when he broke into Alicia Taylor's house. The judge also ruled that these sentences would be served consecutively. Kyle must serve at least 35 years before becoming eligible for parole. During the trial, the 22-year-old offender, who appeared teenage-like from the outside, attempted to explain his actions. He said that some demons in his head took control of his body when he committed the crime. Then the young man broke down and began crying. He couldn't find the strength to say anything more in his defense. However, there was no evidence that Kyle had any mental health issues. The evaluation found him entirely competent and able to understand the consequences of his own actions. The trial ended. Justice prevailed. But the public was left with one unanswered question. Where in the house was Gloria Gary's body hidden that it couldn't be discovered for 9 days? This information became known only from an interview with one of the woman's relatives, as the police declined to comment. The passion for pathological hoarding or Diogenes syndrome is a real and psychiatrically recognized disorder that some people suffer from. Some collect stray animals and bring them to their apartment, not realizing they need quality care and attention. As a result, cats or dogs are kept in unsanitary conditions and breed uncontrollably. Others, concerned about saving money, begin storing old, broken, or worn items, not throwing away food remnants, and then gradually start bringing home discarded items from the street. Eventually, their dwelling begins to resemble a dump, but the owners remain oblivious to this. The third category consists of people who crave new emotions or knowledge. They collect newspapers, magazines, books, slowly cluttering their living space. Because new items keep arriving while old ones remain, disorder reigns in the house. Such a person finds it difficult to part with read books and magazines, which becomes a specific problem over the years. Because 49-year-old Gloria Gary had lived alone for a long time, she learned to brighten her solitude by immersing herself in the romantic atmosphere of love novels and solving mysteries alongside literary detectives. The woman would buy romance novels and detective stories, read them cover to cover, and stack them neatly in cabinets. When bookshelf space ran out, books began piling up on windowsills and furniture. Then, when even that space became scarce, Gloria simply dumped them on the floor. She couldn't bring herself to dispose of even one read book. In the end, the countless romance novels and detective stories became Gloria's grave. There were so many books that the young man who took the homeowner's life simply buried the dead body beneath them. Because there were several such book piles throughout the house, relatives didn't pay proper attention to it. Despite her quirks, Gloria was a very kind and sincere person who was loved by close friends, and she certainly didn't deserve to die at the hands of a spoiled boy. The eternal pursuit of happiness is the simplest path to disappointment. The recently begun married life of two lovers came to a tragic end as soon as they moved into their own house. The young man forcefully pulled his girlfriend from the car and led her to a vehicle parked in the driveway. The girl peered inside with horror, and the first thing she saw was blood. Then her boyfriend dragged her by the hand into the house, where an even more terrible scene awaited them in the bedroom. Would you like something similar to happen to you? These words stayed with the young woman for the rest of her life. Gail Wingarden was born on April 24, 1965, and became part of a large family of 8 members. Her childhood was spent in Ottawa County, Michigan. The Wingarden household wasn't wealthy, but all children grew up surrounded by parental affection and care. Due to the family's financial challenges, Gail dreamed of finding employment and saving money for herself from a very early age. She told her elder sister Cheryl that she would work extensively to afford anything she desired. As a teenager, Gail secured her first position as a server. Although the cafe's base salary was relatively modest, the young woman managed to earn decent money. She consistently received tips that exceeded her regular income. Gail was charming, exceptionally amiable, cheerful, and determined. Moreover, she was physically attractive, so she never lacked male attention. While working as a server, she frequently interacted with patrons who later wished to pursue acquaintance and would wait for her outside the cafe. Fortunately, Gail had a brother, Ryan, who was approximately 2.5 years her senior. Ryan continuously watched over his little sister and always tried to stay close by. When Gail turned 18, she met a man named Lar, and they instantly connected, quickly moving in together and building a house. Most likely, the girl simply wanted to gain independence quickly, as one couldn't say she was truly in love with Lar. The couple lived together briefly, about 13 months. In 1984, 19-year-old Gail met a 25-year-old man named Rick Brink. He was a contractor, and they met at work. It was love at first sight. Gail was captivated by her new acquaintance, while Rick went home and told his mother he'd met the girl he intended to marry. Gail didn't waste time. After meeting Rick, she finally understood that Lar wasn't right for her, and she had indeed rushed into living with him. Their relationship was far from perfect. The girl directly told him things wouldn't work out, and she decided to leave him. When Gail was gathering her belongings to leave the house, Lar lost control and struck her face, leaving a black eye. Once her older brother learned about this, he appeared at the doorstep and gave Lar a sound thrashing. During this, Ryan made sure to thoroughly explain to the man never to touch his sister again. Just days after this, Gail and Rick Brink began dating, and they could easily be called two halves of a whole, as the couple matched perfectly. They shared identical dreams, similar interests, and matching personality traits. Both were hardworking and ambitious. The lovers spent summer at Rick's family lake house. They went boating and water skiing, spending much time outdoors and with family. 3 summer months showed these two were truly an ideal pair, and eventually their relationship reached its logical conclusion. On April 25, 1986, a day after Gail's 21st birthday, the couple married in a cozy little church surrounded by relatives and friends. Rick and Gail held their celebration at a lakeside club. They danced and celebrated with guests all day, then departed at sunset for a brief honeymoon. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. During their honeymoon, the newlyweds enjoyed the beach, seawater, and sunshine. They had already planned what they would do upon returning home. While the couple indulged in relaxation, their parents concerned themselves with purchasing property for the young family. Rick's father managed to find an ideal house for the newlyweds, situated on 20 acres of land on the outskirts of their hometown, Holland, Michigan. The man arranged to buy the building at an advantageous price. Inside, much work remained unfinished, but Rick worked at a furniture company, was handy, and possessed excellent carpentry skills, so home repairs didn't daunt him at all. Rick, Gail, their friends, and relatives together completed the room finishing, repainted the walls, polished the floors, and installed furniture. They say joint renovation reveals how well people understand each other and brings all disagreements to the surface. But for Rick and Gail, setting up the house only united them and confirmed their wonderful relationship. The newlyweds laughed at all their mistakes and constantly joked. They even recorded their renovation on video. The couple moved into their own house, still not completely renovated, in October 1987. By then, Gail and Rick had been married about 18 months. The young wife shared with her sister that the last room they planned to renovate would be a nursery, because their next step in life together would be having children. Gail excitedly described which wallpaper she wanted to hang in the nursery, where she'd place the crib, and how she'd decorate the bedroom. The couple dreamed of filling their house with children's laughter and toys. They were ready to become parents and dreamed of spending the rest of their lives hand in hand. But unfortunately, these dreams were not destined to come true. On Saturday, November 21st, 1987, Rick and Gail attended one of Rick's school friends' wedding. They had a wonderful time, drank a little, and danced. The Brinks departed for home around 11 p.m., and this was the last time they were seen alive. 2 days later, on November 23rd, neither Gail nor Rick showed up for work. Rick worked at a major furniture manufacturing company and was an extremely reliable and diligent employee. It was uncharacteristic of him to simply not come to work without notifying management. Rick's boss immediately sensed something was wrong. He tried calling the Brinks' home phone to check on them, but no one answered. The supervisor then dialed Rick's parents' number to inquire why their son hadn't come to work and wasn't responding to calls. His father and mother were very surprised. They knew such behavior was unlike Rick, so they called Gail's office. That's when they realized the young woman also hadn't appeared at her workplace that day. Rick's parents and his boss simultaneously arrived at the Brinks' house to discover why the couple was ignoring calls. Perhaps they were sick, had overslept, or experienced some kind of accident. Rick's Chevrolet Blazer was parked in the driveway. His father and mother sighed with relief, assuming their son was home, but upon approaching the vehicle and peering inside, they discovered their 28-year-old son's body. He was in the driver's seat, slumped toward the passenger side with his head almost touching the door. Rick's face was covered in blood from a gunshot wound. Horrified by what they saw, the parents didn't enter the house, fearing what they might find inside. They called the Ottawa County Sheriff's Department to report the tragedy. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, they entered the house and proceeded down the hallway to the master bedroom. There, officers found 22-year-old Gail Brink's body. At first glance, she appeared to be sleeping with her head under a pillow. But when officers removed the pillow, they discovered its other side was soaked through with blood. The woman had been shot 3 times point blank in the face. This method of execution suggested certain implications. Police's initial theory was that this might have been a murder followed by suicide. They hypothesized that an argument between the spouses led to Rick shooting Gail, then sitting in his car intending to flee. However, feeling overwhelmed by guilt, he ultimately took his own life. But this theory soon fell apart. No weapon was found in the car with Rick's body. Therefore, he couldn't possibly have shot himself or killed Gail. This meant a third person had carried out this brutal attack on the Brink couple. The perpetrator had killed both victims, then taken the murder weapon with them. It was later determined to be a .22 caliber revolver. Like Gail, Rick was also dispatched by a shot to the head. He had 2 wounds on the left side of his head. A bullet hole was visible in the passenger side window, shattering the glass, while the driver's side window was partially lowered. This led investigators to believe the shooter was known to the victims. Possibly, Rick lowered the window to speak with the perpetrator, clearly feeling no threat. This theory was supported by Gail's face being covered with a pillow. Criminals who knew their victims typically did this. Perhaps after the shooting, they felt guilt and remorse for their actions. Additionally, it became immediately apparent this wasn't a robbery. There were no signs of forced entry. Everything in the house remained in its place, all items neatly arranged where they belonged, except for some clothing scattered on the bedroom floor. Rick's wallet was found on the kitchen counter. It contained a substantial amount of cash. Gail's jewelry also remained openly displayed in the house. No weapon or shell casings were found at all. The perpetrator brought the gun, then took time to clean up. There was no physical evidence at the scene, no foreign fingerprints, hair, or anything that could aid in investigating the double homicide. The found fingerprints belonged to the victims. Only one slightly smudged print was discovered in the bathroom, and one on the phone. These weren't in police databases and could have been from guests or numerous relatives of the deceased couple. The autopsy showed that based on body decomposition, death occurred early Sunday morning, November 22nd, shortly after the Brinks left the wedding celebration. Gail's older brother Ryan said he tried calling his sister Sunday afternoon with no answer. This confirmed the approximate time of death suggested by experts. With no physical evidence, investigators began questioning friends, colleagues, and relatives of Gail and Rick. Ryan told police about his sister's ex-boyfriend and their breakup. He mentioned fighting with Lar for daring to hit Gail. Ryan suggested Lar still felt attached to and possibly jealous of Gail. It pained him to learn she had married and was happy. Detectives immediately brought Lar in for questioning and polygraph testing. The man denied any involvement in the murders. He passed the lie detector test successfully. Additionally, Lar had a perfect alibi, so he was quickly eliminated from the list of potential suspects. Several days after the investigation began, the previous homeowner approached the police station. This person, known as Shotgun Sit, was a member of a notorious Detroit motorcycle gang suspected of human and arms trafficking, plus drug manufacturing and distribution. As a police informant unhappy with hallucinogenic drugs being sold to teenagers, he worked with federal agents to report those selling pills to minors. He suggested the perpetrator might have been targeting him, mistaking the Brinks for his relatives. He'd faced multiple assassination attempts and had to defend himself against intruders at the same house where Gail and Rick later lived. Detectives thoroughly investigated the Detroit motorcycle gang, but after a month found no evidence linking them to the murders. The next theory emerged when another fatal crime occurred on Christmas Eve. Just 2,600 feet from Rick and Gail's house, 30-year-old Deborah Wilson, who had attended the same high school as Rick Brink, became a victim. Her husband returned home early morning to find her missing from the bedroom. The lights were on, and the sliding door leading to a large field behind the house remained open. The man called police to report his wife missing while searching the field for traces of Deborah. He discovered her body with multiple stab wounds. Given the proximity to the Brinks' house and that Deborah and Rick attended the same school, police suspected a possible connection. They then linked these deaths to another case from July 1977. 20-year-old Deborah Polinsky was stabbed multiple times in her bedroom, about a mile from the Brinks' home. Police theorized all three cases were connected to a serial killer. Holland was a small town. The population was terrified that a killer who had taken multiple lives walked free. The double murder of the young couple shocked not only the local community, but made headlines across Michigan. Despite detectives' efforts to find connections between all three cases, none were found. All investigations were frozen. The files sat in archives for 2 decades. Friends and families of the deceased began losing hope of justice for their loved ones. 24 years later, in 2009, the Ottawa County Sheriff's Department created a new cold case unit. Detectives Dave Blakely and Venus Repper, who had worked together for 7 years, would focus exclusively on solving old cases. They knew loyalties change over time. Those who once kept dark secrets or protected someone often change their minds decades later. People might finally want to rid themselves of years of guilt, or view differently those they previously protected. Blakely and Repper started with the Deborah Wilson and Deborah Polinsky cases, but when one suspect died and another confessed, they turned to the Brink murders. First, they reviewed all the case files, double-checking testimonies of witnesses who had any connection to the deceased, and noticed some inconsistency in the account of Gail's brother Ryan Wingarden. His girlfriend Pam, who later became his wife, confirmed that they went to the laundromat that evening. Because the couple ran short of coins to finish their laundry, they stopped by Pam's friend's house near the laundromat to borrow some money, then headed home and spent the whole night together. However, later during the polygraph test, when Pam was asked if she had been with Ryan throughout the night, she answered, "No." For some reason, nobody paid attention to this discrepancy. So the new team of detectives decided to call in Pam and Ryan for questioning again to get to the bottom of everything. Sometimes a thin thread helped unravel difficult cases. In fact, Gail's brother and his wife were never considered suspects. It's just that during investigations, everyone is typically asked a standard question. What were people doing during the hours when the crime occurred? By now, the Wingardens had been married for 23 years. They had 3 children together, and Pam's son from another partner. Her son was only 6 months old when Ryan proposed to her. Detectives Blakely and Rapper went to the Wingardens' house to talk again with both Gail's brother and his wife. However, husband and wife repeated that they went to the laundromat in the evening and spent the night together. They couldn't remember anything else from that evening. In reality, the police had nothing to hold against Pam, because anyone could forget what they said 20 years ago. The detectives couldn't obtain more information about the case, but this inconsistency still bothered them, so they decided to take a closer look at the Wingarden couple and talk to other people from their lives. The investigators were certain that Pam was hiding something. Digging into Pam and Ryan's past, the detectives discovered that in 1987, when the crime occurred, Gail's brother was dating 2 women simultaneously. One of his girlfriends was named Crystal Bann, and the special unit officers decided to locate Chris and ask her several questions about her former boyfriend. It turned out that Chris and Ryan had split up, but remained on good terms, almost like friends. The woman didn't provide any additional information regarding Wingarden. The detectives were about to leave when Chris told them there was one thing she hadn't mentioned. In her opinion, Ryan treated his sister Gail somewhat differently than his other sisters. Sometimes he made such inappropriate comments about her that it became clear he was attracted to Gail as a woman, even despite their family ties. Once, after his sister and her husband's death, Ryan confessed to Chris that he had had an intimate relationship with Gail. It started when his sister was 9 and he was 12 years old. The man claimed these were consensual relations, except for the last time. Gail said no, but he forced her. Detectives Blakely and Rapper couldn't believe that 9-year-old Gail could have entered into any consensual relationship. Most likely, she became a victim of controlling behavior and manipulation by her older brother. Then Chris described how Ryan showed her a photo from an outing where he and his sister were boating. Gail was in a bikini, and the man characterized her as hot and alluring. He looked at his sister's photo with lustful eyes. It was this gaze that led Chris to conclude that Ryan had inappropriate feelings toward Gail, clearly experiencing emotions far from brotherly. However, the ex-girlfriend's statement about Wingarden being infatuated with his sister was clearly insufficient to accuse him of the double homicide. Therefore, the detectives had to continue searching and try to obtain some evidence. They decided to talk with other Wingarden family members and were very surprised. It turned out that Ryan's older sister Cheryl hadn't really been in contact with her brother for the past several years. They had quarreled after their father's death and hadn't even spoken for a long time. Then suddenly, after Ryan's police interrogation, the brother himself reached out to his older sister and suggested forgetting all grievances and reconciling. When detectives shared the information they received from Chris about Ryan harassing Gail with Cheryl, she was speechless and simply shocked. The woman had no idea such things could happen in her family. Cheryl speculated that Gail hadn't told her about Ryan's advances because she feared her older sister's reaction. The girl surely knew that Cheryl wouldn't stay quiet. She would confront their brother immediately. Then Cheryl recalled how at Gail and Rick's funeral, Ryan said some peculiar things. He said he could vividly imagine how it all happened, how the perpetrator walked down the hallway in the Brinks house and saw Gail lying in bed. Then her brother pondered if he could do something like that. At that time, Cheryl assumed Ryan was experiencing intense emotional pain from losing his younger sister and was just expressing his grief in that way. Further conversations with Ryan Wingarden's relatives and friends confirmed the information investigators received from his former girlfriend, Crystal Bann, and added several suspicious details to the overall picture. It turned out that Ryan had offered one of his friends to buy Gail's waterbed at a good price, the same bed where she lost her life. Additionally, he looked through his sister's personal letters after her death, found several messages from men and burned them, justifying that he didn't want other family members to see the letters. Another friend told police that Ryan had discussed his intimate relationship with Gail with him. Wingarden even managed to discuss this topic with his stepson. Ryan and Gail's aunt remembered that on the eve of the tragedy, both nephews called her complaining about each other. Gail was upset that her brother owed her money she had lent him for a car, and Ryan didn't like that his sister had suddenly distanced herself from the family after marriage, focusing only on her own affairs. She wouldn't allow their parents' mobile home to be placed on her property, where they were living with the younger children at the time, arguing that it wasn't safe while renovations were ongoing. All these peculiarities regarding Ryan Wingarden made investigators believe that he could indeed have some connection to the killing of Gail and Rick. However, the police still lacked physical evidence of his involvement in the case. They needed something more substantial, and therefore the detectives decided to talk to Ryan's wife again, as they were convinced that Pam knew more than she was saying. When brought in for questioning at the police station, the woman arrived accompanied by her husband. Compared to the very mild-mannered Pam, Ryan appeared harsh and domineering. He insisted on being present during his wife's interrogation, but wasn't allowed. His nervousness about this was apparent. The conversation with Pam lasted 3 hours. The woman needed some time to gather her thoughts and reveal that her husband's alibi was false. That day, they did go to the laundromat around 6 p.m. They came home no later than 8 p.m., but Ryan soon left again and Pam had no idea where to. Her husband returned only the next morning. At the time, they were having financial difficulties and Ryan occasionally dealt illegal substances to make ends meet. So Pam assumed her husband might get into trouble if police learned about his illegal income. She provided an alibi, saying he was home with her all night. Ryan had forced her to maintain this alibi for many years. This was all the information the woman provided to investigators, and they couldn't get any further confessions from her. However, detectives saw there was something more to this story that Pam wasn't telling. Most likely her husband kept her under tight control, or she was simply afraid of her spouse. This was especially strange because Pam was the sole breadwinner. She worked full-time to support their family of 6, while her husband was a homemaker and homeschooled their children. After the 3-hour interrogation, Ryan was already knocking on doors demanding his wife's release. He himself refused to admit his alibi was false and kept insisting on the first version. He spent the entire night when Gail and Rick died in the marital bed. When Ryan was asked about what kind of relationship he had with his younger sister, the man was even offended. There was some initial awkwardness in the conversation, but then Ryan said that he and Gail were just 2 kids exploring each other. The couple was released home without providing any concrete information, and over the next few days, Ryan called Detective Blakely, leaving crazy voicemail messages. There were about 30 of them. Ryan said strange things, that he hated the police, but also valued them because they were a necessary evil. The man accused investigators of threatening his wife while trying to uncover some dirty family history. This person was clearly unstable, and leaving him on city streets was unsafe. However, Detectives Blakely and Rapper still had no legal grounds to put Ryan behind bars. In January 2013, investigators called Pam to the police station for another interrogation. They told her they wouldn't back down until they got to the truth, and it was in her interest to tell the whole story and give closure to the deceased couple's relatives. This time Pam came without her husband and behaved much more calmly and openly. The woman finally told police the whole truth about that horrible night. Pam repeated that after the laundromat they returned home, then he left and came back only the next morning. At 9 a.m., Ryan started pounding on the door like a madman. When the woman let her boyfriend in, she saw he was crying. Ryan confessed that he had shot his younger sister and her husband. Naturally, Pam was shocked. At that time, she and Ryan had just started living together. Their relationship was exactly 3 months old. She was a single mother with a 6-month-old son. The man treated the boy very well and cared for him. And now, with one phrase, Ryan had destroyed all her hopes for a happy future together. Ryan went to Rick and Gail's house that evening to discuss family matters. First, he owed his sister money for the car payment. Second, he wanted to revisit the situation with their parents' mobile home. However, instead of constructive dialogue, they had a fierce argument, and Rick asked his wife's brother to leave their house and never return. An upset Gail went to the bedroom, and an enraged Ryan stormed out, but returned 20 minutes later saying his car wouldn't start. He asked Rick to get in his car and help him get onto the road. Once Rick was in the car, Ryan approached the open driver's side window and shot Rick twice in the head, then entered the house where Gail was sleeping and shot her 3 times in the face. Ryan explained to Pam that he didn't like his sister's behavior. After marriage, Gail seemed to forget about all her relatives. While Pam was processing this information, Ryan forced her into the car and drove to the Brinks' house. Grabbing one arm, he dragged the shocked woman first to the car, then forcibly into the house, to the bedroom where dead Gail lay. Ryan deliberately showed Pam the horrific scene because then he warned his girlfriend that if she ever told anyone about this, the same would happen to her and her son. Ryan took his girlfriend to his home and showed her the .22 caliber revolver he used during the crime, as well as a bag with blood-stained clothes. Ryan invented an alibi and, threatening violence, forced Pam to repeat it to police. The woman carried this terrible secret for the next 25 years. She attended Rick and Gail's funeral, interacted with grief-stricken relatives, knowing who had actually taken the young couple's lives. Pam couldn't tell anyone about what happened out of fear for herself and her son. Probably for the same reason, she married Ryan and had 3 more children with him. Ryan had so thoroughly intimidated Pam that he could completely manipulate her. She earned the family's living and feared contradicting her spouse in any way. The man called her at work daily to check what she was doing, wouldn't allow her to make friends. He controlled her every move, so essentially, this woman became another of Ryan's victims. Yet it's very difficult to accept that someone knew the truth and carefully concealed it for 25 years while Rick and Gail's families mourned and grieved for the deceased. After Pam's 3-hour police interrogation, when she admitted to the false alibi, Ryan called her a traitor and threatened to finish her off. Then, he changed his psychological pressure tactics and started convincing his wife that the detectives had clearly abused her and forced her to lie. The man even planned to sue the investigators for exceeding their authority and mistreating his wife, but limited himself to voice messages to one detective. While Pam sat at the police station telling the whole truth about that horrible night, Ryan continuously called and messaged her. During this time, he dialed his wife's number more than 100 times, So the detectives decided that Ryan needed to be taken into custody immediately before he harmed someone else. The criminal hiding the dark secret was arrested that same day to prevent him from disposing of any evidence or escaping. While Ryan was behind bars awaiting trial, he sent Pam 29 letters in which he accused her of lying, then begged her to recant her testimony. The trial of Ryan Wyngarden began in March 2014. He was 51 years old at the time. The prosecution presented a case claiming the defendant killed his own sister and her husband out of fear that Gail would tell Rick about the incestuous relationship she had endured. Ryan envied his younger sister's success because she had managed to improve her standard of living while he experienced financial difficulties. During the trial, 60 witnesses testified against Ryan, with his wife Pam being the key witness. She confirmed everything she had told investigators during questioning. After that, Ryan jumped from his seat and started shouting that she was an evil woman with a black heart trying to slander him. As a result, the defendant was removed from his own trial. One of his cellmates revealed that while Ryan was in custody, he bragged about carrying out the killing of the Brink couple. He also talked about his sister Cheryl, who had campaigned for the past 25 years to solve the case of Gail and Rick's deaths. Ryan also stated that he would have finished off Cheryl long ago if he had known how much trouble his older sister would cause him. At the next court session, Ryan testified in his defense. His speech was incoherent. First and foremost, he wanted to dismiss the accusations of harassing his younger sister. The man stated that they were children then and were just interested in this peculiar game. Ryan described only 3 intimate incidents between him and Gail. The first time they were 9 and 12, respectively. They were naked in the shower, just comparing body parts. The second time, Ryan found a pipe with marijuana residue in their father's car. He and Gail tried lighting it and inhaling some smoke, after which they touched each other briefly. The third incident occurred when she was 12 and he was 15. Ryan was using marijuana again and made advances on Gail. They touched each other's intimate parts with their hands, but there was no sexual intercourse. All of this was consensual, according to him. Ryan also stated he didn't consider their teenage experiences with his sister horrible. He wouldn't have cared if she had told her husband about it. So he claimed he had no motive to take both their lives. The defendant cried and seemed to genuinely not understand why his wife Pam and sister Cheryl testified against him. He believed authorities pressured the women, wanting to imprison him and pin the unsolved case on him. However hard Ryan's lawyers tried to twist the facts, their tactics failed. On March 28, 2014, Ryan was found guilty of taking Gail and Rick's lives. The judge sentenced him to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Even during the sentencing, Ryan constantly interrupted the judge, insisting on his innocence. Ryan Wyngarden appealed his sentence 3 times, including to the Supreme Court, but all appeals were rejected. The only person dissatisfied with the sentence, besides the defendant, was Ryan and Gail's mother. The elderly woman didn't believe her son could take his own sister's life. One can understand her because almost any mother would defend her child to the end. It's just sad that, having many children, the mother missed some aspects of their upbringing. When you encounter an attractive man on the street, you'll never guess what he's thinking while looking at you. Could it be admiration, curiosity, indifference, or a desire to cook you up deliciously? After putting her baby daughter to bed, the woman turned on her computer. She wanted to take a brief break from the daily hustle and household chores. Imagine her astonishment when she discovered her own bikini photo on some peculiar unknown website. But that wasn't even the most shocking part, as the woman began reading user comments that predicted a rather tragic end for her. They suggested chloroforming her, binding her, gagging her mouth, and kidnapping her, only to butcher her like an animal carcass and make kebabs. The woman couldn't believe her eyes. gripped by horror and incredible fear for her life. Yet these weren't all the revelations she was about to uncover. Today's story revolves around a person named Gilberto Valle, who once swore to serve New York's residents and protect them from dangers. He was known to friends and colleagues as a dedicated police officer, but Gilberto led a sinister double life that stunned everyone. The media dubbed him the Cannibal Cop, and his arrest exposed an entire network of twisted fantasies and detailed plans that had been brewing in his mind. Whether Gilberto was a monster or just an ordinary person with a terrifying imagination, we'll try to determine today. Gilberto Valle was born on April 14, 1984, and lived with his family in a peaceful, secure neighborhood in Queens, New York. He was the eldest child in the family. His parents frequently quarreled and ultimately separated when Gilberto, their oldest son, was 5 years old. In elementary school, Gilberto was a quiet, shy child, but as he grew older, he gained many friends and became popular. The boy performed well academically and played baseball from age 11. Even then, he began having frequent thoughts about girls, but his private fantasies differed from those of most adolescents. Gilberto discovered he always dreamed about girls and imagined them restrained and helpless. This particularly fascinated him. Gilberto attended a Catholic high school and played on the baseball team, receiving a small scholarship. His youth coincided with the 90s, when many children first encountered the internet. It was an exciting and thrilling time to log into the system and present yourself as a completely different person, and nobody would ever know who you really were. You could be whoever you wanted. This was how Gilberto immersed himself in the World Wide Web and spent many hours in various chat rooms with random people until he eventually stumbled upon adult content. This was truly a shocking discovery for a teenager of that era. In high school, Gilberto first fell for a girl named Melanie, and they became good friends. The boy wanted more, but Melanie was only interested in friendship. So the pair spent their days together, walking and talking about everything under the sun. But in the dark nights, Gilberto would fantasize about this girl. In his fantasies, she was always bound, helpless, and gagged. After finishing high school, Gilberto enrolled in college to pursue a psychology degree. As his minor, the young man chose criminal justice. Gilberto studied well, received excellent grades, and praise from professors. Though later the young man admitted that focusing on lessons was very difficult, because the girls around him were simply magnificent. And each time he imagined restraining them, then cooking them on a grill like turkeys. These were the peculiar fantasies this young man had. Fortunately, they remained only in his mind. Generally, Gilberto was a typical student, attending parties, playing pranks on friends, and meeting girls. But he never became intimate with any of them. In his free time from studies, the young man spent time on the computer, searching for sites with various unconventional interests. That's how he found a fetish site centered on consuming human flesh. It was on this site that Gilberto learned many new things. For instance, that he wasn't alone and there were others around dreaming of similar things. Then he met users who wrote fictional stories about their private preferences. Some of the stories were quite graphic and included elaborate desires about capturing and preparing victims. After discovering such websites, Gilberto no longer worried there was something wrong with him, and he stopped considering himself abnormal. However, he didn't share his dreams with anyone, keeping them secret. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. In 2006, after receiving his diploma from the University of Maryland, the young professional returned to his father's house and applied to serve in the New York Police Department. It was necessary to have an interview with a psychologist to ensure that Gilberto was mentally fit to work in the police force. Naturally, he tactfully remained silent about his private inclinations, understanding that he could be misunderstood. During police training, Rookies were often sent to patrol the toughest districts of the city to immediately identify the weak ones. It was quite demanding work, but Gilberto handled it excellently. In his free time from work, he continued visiting his favorite websites and many different forums related to his private dreams. New photos and new stories were uploaded there daily. Once Gilberto even thought about contributing and writing some personal story, but then decided not to risk it, fearing that someone he knew might read his revelation. In 2009, Gilberto created a profile on a dating site to find a girlfriend. But things never went beyond a couple of dates. Then he began searching for a partner on social networks, but instead stumbled upon a website that touched him deeply. The website's welcome page had the following message: "Welcome to the social network, where you won't feel like an outcast because of your dark interest, because this place was created specifically for people like you. Feel free to look around, meet crazy in a good way people, and become part of our adult community. Please remember that this place is dedicated only to your fantasies and nothing else." Gilberto realized this was exactly what he had been looking for. He registered and created the username Girl Meet Hunter. In his profile description, he indicated that he was interested in fantasies involving kidnapping people, abuse, and consuming human flesh. One of the website's entertainments was to take a photo of a random person from social networks and post it on your page with the question of what would you do with them. And all visitors would write their most hidden desires in the comments, some of which were terrible and graphic. But fortunately, these were just fantasies. Gilberto really enjoyed participating and expressing himself in such online games. Sometimes he even posted photos of his former classmates and proposed discussing their candidacies. During these years, each of Gilberto's days was similar to the next. He lived at his father's house, worked a lot, occasionally went on dates, and then spent his free time on interest websites. This continued until the man met a girl named Kathleen Mangan. By this point, Gilberto was already 25 years old, and by his own admission, he still had not had an intimate connection with women. Caitlin had recently arrived in New York and secured a job as a teacher in an elementary school. On their first date, the young couple discovered they had much in common and had been inseparable ever since. From the very first meeting, Caitlin Megan became the main character in Gilberto's intimate fantasies. He imagined forcibly abducting her against her will, binding her, baking her, and then placing Caitlin on a large platter with an apple in her mouth. Naturally, the guy did not share this with his girlfriend, not wanting to frighten her. But in his thoughts, he constantly envisioned such scenes. A couple of weeks after meeting, Gilberto officially began courting Caitlin. After a year of acquaintance, they moved in together and started living in a small apartment in Manhattan. Soon, their family expanded when they got a bulldog, because Caitlin adored this particular breed. Even her college mascot had been a bulldog. The first years of their relationship were positive. The lovers laughed and joked a lot. According to Caitlin, Gilberto was very sweet, respectful towards women, and never quarreled with anyone. She knew absolutely nothing about his online interests and did not even suspect his secret and intimate fantasies. In January 2011, Caitlin learned she was pregnant. But Gilberto's initial reaction to his partner's pregnancy was negative because he primarily thought about financial issues. The emergence of an infant frightened the man. He was afraid to take responsibility for a small life, but after getting somewhat accustomed to the idea of becoming a father, he and Caitlin sat down and discussed all their concerns. The future parents tried to encourage each other and assure themselves that together they would manage. And soon after a few months, the man was eagerly awaiting the birth of his firstborn and even attempted to read specialized literature for future parents. Gilberto and Caitlin moved to a larger apartment in Forest Hills, and in September 2011, they had a girl. The new parents chose a beautiful name for her, Josephine. The birth of a daughter did not mean that Valle abandoned his secret interests. He still spent much time on a fetishist website, and had become quite a well-known personality there. Site visitors enjoyed reading his fantasies. The man even gained online friends from this community. The following year, Gilberto passed the sergeant exam and completely immersed himself in work. Caitlin transformed into a housewife and looked after the baby. Eventually, they got married, having lived in a civil union for a long time. Josephine's appearance necessitated legalizing their relationship. It seemed everything would improve, but their marriage could not be called happy, as Gilberto was always working and came home exhausted. All childcare responsibilities fell on his wife's shoulders. After the child's birth, there was no intimacy in their relationship. No matter how Caitlin tried to seduce her husband, it always ended with him running to the bathroom, unable to complete the sexual act. And after some time, Gilberto simply began avoiding intimacy with his wife. He would come home from work and play video games, watch television, or just sit on the internet until 3 to 4 in the morning. He would go to bed only after Caitlin had fallen asleep, tired of waiting for his return. After a tense workday at the police department, the man wanted to relax, not listen to his wife's reproaches or face her disapproving look. One day, Gilberto's computer broke down. While it was being fixed, he decided to use Kathleen's computer. Initially, he resisted using it to visit certain websites. He worried the data would be saved and his wife would discover his browsing history. But apparently, desire won out one day and Gilberto let his guard down. Not only did he visit these peculiar websites from his wife's computer, but he also forgot to close his tabs. When Gilberto was at work, Kathleen put their daughter to sleep and decided to spend some time online to unwind from the daily routine. She opened the browser and discovered disturbing images and concerning user comments. The woman was shocked by what she found. While she had previously blamed herself for their intimate life problems, thinking she wasn't appealing enough, now Kathleen understood there was something else entirely going on. When her husband returned from work, she decided to have a serious conversation with him. Kathleen told Gilberto the truth about discovering the websites he visited in his free time. However, she wasn't planning to judge him, but merely suggested they try together to revitalize their marriage. The woman hoped this conversation would be a breakthrough for them, but somewhere deep down, she understood this wasn't the whole truth about her husband. At one point, Kathleen suspected Gilberto was unfaithful. Her understanding was that only a relationship with another woman could pull her husband away from his marital duties, so she decided to install monitoring software on his computer to see what he did online when she wasn't around. What she discovered was far worse than her initial suspicions. The very next day, Kathleen was able to see all the websites her spouse visited and his correspondence with new acquaintances from different countries. And that's when she truly became frightened. There were photos of acquaintances and friends with disturbing comments. And then in her husband's correspondence with one person, Kathleen saw her own face and messages where they discussed in detail what they planned to do with her. Binding her legs, cutting her throat, and watching the blood flow. This was just one of the quotes that stunned the woman. She couldn't even imagine such horrors. Yet here was her own husband having such discussions about her fate. The entire correspondence seemed so real that Kathleen became convinced her husband intended to actually do this to her. She was so frightened that she packed her things that same day and left with their daughter to her parents in Nevada. She didn't even want to hear her husband's explanation. When the initial wave of fear subsided, Kathleen decided to use the monitoring software again to see what her husband was now discussing with his new acquaintances. Kathleen again found disturbing content. Additionally, the woman checked her husband's browser history. Gilberto had searched for methods of causing harm and also searched for recipes involving human flesh. In correspondence with his online friends, Gilberto discussed preparing a woman in olive oil over an open fire and using her severed head as a centerpiece for the feast. Just imagining this made Kathleen feel ill. She learned many more shocking details about her spouse that day thanks to the monitoring software. Kathleen saw a whole folder of photographs of various women, both familiar and unfamiliar, more than 80 in total. She read messages where her husband and other site visitors discussed various methods of abduction and other disturbing acts. He was very active and chatted with approximately 24 different users. The more Kathleen investigated Gilberto's computer, the worse she felt, because in the electronic correspondence, she herself was the main intended victim. The woman now knew what her husband and his correspondents planned to do with her, and thanked God she managed to escape in time. In reality, in several letters, Gilberto mentioned that all of this was nothing more than fantasies, hidden desires, and none of the above would happen in real life. But Kathleen, being in a state of extreme horror and panic, didn't notice this. She concluded that her husband was dangerous and needed to be stopped immediately. The woman contacted authorities and presented them with all these disturbing messages. She also told them that according to the correspondence, Gilberto was planning to abduct her and end her life. On October 24, 2012, a group of FBI agents headed to Gilberto's apartment in Forest Hills to make an arrest. The agents didn't want police officer Gilberto to resist, or worse, start a shootout. They called him on the phone and said someone had hit his parked car. A confused Gilberto, wearing a casual t-shirt and sweatpants, came out of the house and immediately found himself surrounded by FBI agents. The man was placed under arrest, charged with conspiracy to abduct and harm others. He ultimately spent 5 months behind bars awaiting trial. During the investigation, the FBI identified specific emails in which Gilberto had devised strategies and planned to make them real. Additionally, agents checked Gilberto's work computer and discovered that the officer had used software available to him as a law enforcement officer for personal purposes, illegally accessing the police database. All this pointed to Gilberto's specific intent to commit a crime. While Gilberto awaited the start of the trial, details of his correspondence began to surface. The media focused on the story of a husband secretly planning to abduct several women, including his own wife, Kathleen. Once the media caught wind of this story, all the hidden conversations emerged and caused a significant stir. The Cannibal Cop, that's what reporters dubbed him. The identities of his associates, with whom Gilberto exchanged correspondence, photographs, and stories about what he would do to various women, became known to the general public. The FBI identified 3 specific individuals with whom Gilberto communicated in recent months. These were Michael Van Hees, a 22-year-old auto mechanic from southern New Jersey, Dale Bollinger, a British national, and a man from Pakistan named Ali Khan. It was with these pen pals that Gilberto conducted preparations for a future abduction in January 2012. Gilberto sent Michael Van Hees an email with photographs of a woman named Alicia, with whom they worked together, and Michael offered to abduct her for Gilberto for $5,000. The police officer, putting his law enforcement career at risk, demanded assurance that the woman would never be found after the abduction. Otherwise, he would face significant problems. All this discussion clearly indicated planned criminal activities. Around the same time, Gilberto corresponded with Ali Khan and proposed taking his wife Caitlin on a trip to Pakistan, where they would together end her life and prepare her for dinner. Subsequently, Gilberto sent Ali a photograph of Caitlin in a bikini and boasted about how appetizing she looked. With his third friend, the Briton Dale, Gilberto discussed dealing with his former college friend named Andrea. The man wanted to make her suffer and beg for help. As later discovered, Dale was already constructing a special device in his basement to suspend a woman by her feet. Gilberto bragged to his friends that his house had an oven large enough to accommodate a victim. Furthermore, Gilberto knew of a location in the mountains where there was no one for miles around. They could transport a woman of their choice there and do whatever they desired with her. The conspirators focused on one of Gilberto's college friends, a woman named Kimberly. FBI agents obtained a Word document where they discussed abducting and preparing Kimberly. Gilberto listed materials he would need to carry out this task. For example, the list included strong rope, chloroform, a gag, tape, and then tarp or plastic bags to protect the trunk from any DNA evidence. Gilberto used the NYPD database to search for detailed information about various women he knew who were targets of his discussions. The searches typically included basic information such as home address, date of birth, height, weight, bust size, eye color, criminal records, and more. Prosecutors considered Gilberto's plans to be more than just disturbed fantasies. Unfortunately, or fortunately, during the apartment search, they found no physical evidence indicating he was preparing to abduct or cook anyone. The oven in his kitchen was standard size. No chloroform, gags, or rope were found in the house either. There were also no coordinates of the secluded mountain location Gilberto had written to his friends about. So whether this was all just fantasy, or if an abduction was actually being planned, remained to be determined. On December 31, 2012, attorneys requested a court psychiatrist conduct a psychiatric evaluation of their client. The doctor's task was to determine and express an opinion on how real Gilberto's web persona was and whether it could manifest in real life. In other words, if there were preconditions for this. The doctor had already reviewed Gilberto's questionnaire that he completed when applying to the police department. The psychological test, containing numerous questions, was typically used as a tool to assess personality traits and identify mental pathologies. It was used to check the future employee's stress resistance and evaluate their level of preparedness for work. The conversation with the psychotherapist lasted for 3 days, totaling about 18 hours. Gilberto openly discussed everything related to his intimate life, starting from his teenage years. The man explained that he had always been quite shy and embarrassed to tell anyone about the thoughts that came into his head. When he began sharing his interests with strangers on the internet, he was caught up in a wave and couldn't stop. Everyone waited for the doctor to answer the main question. Could Gilberto Valle's fantasies manifest in real life? Could this person have been preparing an actual abduction and subsequent harm to his own wife, and all these women whose photos appeared in his correspondence? According to the doctor, Officer Gilberto had no mental disorders and created the impression of a very pleasant, positive person. He did indeed have unusual and even criminal fantasies, but there was a huge gap between them and their real-world implementation. The psychotherapist was confident that for Gilberto, it was enough to talk with someone and fantasize about this topic, but he didn't seem like a person who could begin to act. The doctor found no concerning precursors in his behavior. This was exactly the expert conclusion the attorneys were waiting for, ready to present at the trial in Gilberto's defense. Gilberto went on trial in February 2013. 2 different cases with 1 defendant were discussed. The former police officer faced life imprisonment on charges of conspiracy to kidnap, and a maximum of 5 years for unauthorized access to the Federal National Crime Information Center database. The uniqueness of this case lay in the fact that all evidence used against Gilberto was based on his thoughts and fantasies documented in correspondence with friends. The defense team emphasized that while the defendant's interests and discussions were disturbing and even repulsive, ultimately they weren't criminal. Nothing illegal had actually occurred. Most of the charges centered on emails exchanged between Gilberto and his friends from the fetish club. In response to the accusations, attorneys showed Gilberto's profile on the website cited by prosecutors, where it was written that the author was only expressing his own fantasies and nothing more. The defense team also tried to prove that Gilberto made plans, but never acted on them. This was evident from letters where the men planned to abduct 3 different women on President's Day. The holiday had long passed, but all potential victims were alive and well. The harm remained only in the minds and correspondence of the would-be criminals. The prosecution, in turn, portrayed Gilberto as a man who had lost control, They mentioned the fact that the defendant used the NYPD database to search for women's addresses, and this was evidence that he was planning to take action. Gilberto's wife testified against him. After this, she obtained a divorce, took their young daughter, and completely cut off all contact with her ex-husband and his family. Throughout the trial, Gilberto himself maintained that the chat messages were merely fantasy and that he had no intention of acting on them. The situation was ambiguous. The prosecutor gave the jury an example to consider. He compared Gilberto's fantasies to those of a chef who dreamed of poisoning his clients. If they learned that the chef of their favorite restaurant was day and night searching the internet for poisons, telling his friends how he planned to slip poison into some patron's food, would they still go to the restaurant? After all, the chef would call these just his dark fantasies. The trial of Officer Gilberto lasted just over a month. On March 12, 2013, the jury returned with a verdict and found Gilberto guilty of conspiracy to kidnap and harm others. He was also convicted on the second count related to illegally accessing and using law enforcement databases for personal purposes. The guilty verdict also led to his dismissal from the police force. Many of Gilberto's team and family members disagreed with the verdict. It appeared the man was being prosecuted for his fantasies and dark thoughts. At this point, Gilberto hadn't done anything that violated the law, and prosecuting him for unconventional desires was considered wrong and too harsh. Nevertheless, the jurors were convinced that sooner or later the defendant would have broken the law and harmed at least one of the intended victims. His fantasies were like an addiction that would require a larger and larger dose each time. It all ended with Gilberto Valle filing an appeal against his sentence shortly after it was handed down. More than 12 months later, in June 2014, a federal district court judge overturned Gilberto's conviction for conspiracy and intended harm, stating there wasn't sufficient evidence to support it. The evidence suggested that the internet messages about kidnapping women were most likely a fantasy role-playing game. That's exactly how the judge characterized Gilberto's correspondence. By that time, Gilberto had spent 21 months in confinement. He was released from prison to house arrest in his mother's apartment. Bail was set at $100,000. Under the terms of release, Gilberto had to wear an electronic ankle monitor. He was prohibited from using the internet. The former New York police officer smiled at his family and embraced his attorneys while leaving the courtroom. He took advantage of the reporter's presence to apologize to anyone who was hurt, shocked, or offended by his immature actions. Outwardly, the former officer gave the impression of being a highly dedicated servant of the law. He was respected on duty and had never received any complaints about his work. In photographs, Gilberto frequently smiled, showing everyone his playful nature and leaving positive impressions. Colleagues said he could find a reason to laugh in any situation and cheer up everyone around him. And in December 2015, the Second Circuit Court affirmed the decision to overturn the conviction for unauthorized access to law enforcement databases. All criminal charges against Gilberto were dismissed. His attorney stated that this ruling was a crucial victory not only for Officer Gilberto, but also for society as a whole, which valued freedom of thought and expression. However, this story had positive outcomes. The FBI obtained substantial information about other potential criminals, all thanks to the illegal website. On January 4, 2013, they arrested Michael Vangus, who admitted to police that he harbored violent, intimate fantasies, some involving minors. His wife told reporters that she learned about his fetishes before they married and that she had accepted it calmly. Then, 2 more men who spent time on the fetishist website were arrested. These were Richard Melt, a 65-year-old former police chief in Bedford, Massachusetts, and Robert Ashe, a 61-year-old former high school librarian. The librarian had previously faced charges for inappropriate contact with 4 male students, but the charges were later dropped. Unlike Gilberto, these 2 men, Robert Ashe and Richard Melt, crossed the line. An undercover agent arranged a meeting with them to which they brought a bag that was later found to contain a stun gun, skewers, and other items discussed in their correspondence. Investigators realized these two were clearly prepared to transform their fantasies into reality, so both were arrested and brought to court. Another of Gilberto's online correspondents, British citizen Dale Bollinger, was also detained by British authorities for harassing an underage schoolgirl. The man met a girl who was only 14 years old and arranged a meeting with her, before which he purchased an axe and brought it to the date. The fact was that in emails, he had told Gilberto about his fantasies about decapitating victims and then acquiring the tool before the date with the high school student. His actions were recognized as intent to cause bodily harm, so people who feared that someone with such inclinations might eventually snap and succumb to their dark desires were somewhat right. After his release, Gilberto tried to obtain custody of his daughter Josephine, or at least arrange visits with her, but Kathleen was against it. She said that their daughter would one day grow up to be a woman, and then her father's fantasies might extend to her. The man initially planned to contest this in court, but ultimately abandoned the case because there were too many legal expenses he couldn't afford. In 2017, Gilberto Valle gave an interview where, in his defense, he said that people don't choose what arouses them. He agreed that his messages about intimate preferences, described in correspondence with visitors to the fetishist website, indeed appeared strange and frightening to normal people. But it was never anything real. It was all just fiction. He served as a police officer and would never have committed crimes. Eventually, Gilberto found an outlet for himself in literature. In 2017, he wrote a memoir titled Raw Deal, the untold story of the cannibal cop from the New York police. In 2018, Gilberto published another work, The Gathering Evil. The book's description states that the story tells of two young New York residents who become targets of a group of wealthy and influential people. Apparently, this is how Gilberto Valle managed to contain his dark fantasies by putting them on paper. Because of his terrible secret, he lost his family and his police job, but gained questionable notoriety that allowed him to speak openly about his desires. The story of Gilberto Valle, the cannibal cop from New York, ended well for both the offender and his potential victims. However, it remains unknown whether he can continue to contain his dark fantasies. A young woman from a small town dreamed of changing her life by meeting the man of her dreams. For this, she even moved to a big city. Everything was going wonderfully until suddenly, this dream turned into a real nightmare. In April 2012, Brenda Becks relocated to Greenville, North Carolina, because in the town where she was born, her potential was considerably limited. The woman wanted to achieve something greater in her life, encounter her dream man, and start her own family. In an unfamiliar place, she had to adapt to many things, because there were no people nearby who could support her in difficult times. But over time, her circle of acquaintances expanded, and friends appeared among them, including one married couple. Looking at them, Brenda imagined herself with her own man. She liked the relationship between the spouses, she admired them, and one day, the young woman dared to ask her friends if they knew any single men. To Brenda's surprise, the couple immediately became excited about the idea of finding a suitable life partner, and soon declared they had found an almost perfect guy named Paul Edwards for her. The couple showed Brenda a photograph of their bachelor friend, and she liked him at first sight. After mutual approval of the candidates for acquaintance, the friends arranged a personal meeting for Brenda and Paul. The man turned out to be not only physically attractive, but also very sweet, kind, and courteous. In Brenda's eyes, he was that knight in shining armor, large, strong, and capable of protecting her from any trouble. Paul also liked the woman. Most of all, he was pleased that she came from a small town and was modest, sweet, and charming. They began to communicate and talk about their past. Paul shared that his grandmother raised him and that they were very close. Brenda thought this was a good sign, and in turn, she told her new acquaintance about life in the province. By the end of the day, Paul and Brenda felt very comfortable with each other and decided to continue getting to know one another. After the first date came a second, third, and soon the couple became inseparable. Brenda introduced her boyfriend to her mother, and the woman approved of her daughter's choice. Paul made a good impression on her, and the mother was confident that in the future he would become a good husband for Brenda. Paul brought his girlfriend for a weekend to visit the grandmother who raised him, and excellent relationships also formed between them. The elderly woman, of course, due to her age, was surprised that everything was happening so quickly, but she liked Brenda, and the grandmother was happy for her grandson. In reality, their romance truly developed very rapidly. Everything was moving in the right direction, so Brenda didn't even have time to notice any flaws in her chosen one. The young woman simply gave in to her emotions and felt that her decision to move to the big city was the best choice in her life. A couple of months had passed since their first meeting when Paul and Brenda realized they knew each other well enough, and it was time to try living together. They were only separating for a few hours of sleep anyway, so living together became a natural transition to a more serious stage in their relationship. Brenda was madly in love and preferred to spend every free minute with her man. At that time, they were just in the honeymoon phase, so the future still appeared rosy. However, several months later, Brenda began to realize that she had lost contact with almost all of her friends, giving attention only to Paul. She still loved her man, but at some point felt that she missed socializing with friends. Brenda shared with Paul that she wanted to meet up with her girlfriends, have fun somewhere in female company. Her chosen one nodded understandingly and agreed. But every time she scheduled a meeting with her friends, Paul would come up with plans for an evening together. He would guiltily confess that he had prepared a surprise for Brenda and completely forgot about her event. Everything led to Brenda canceling her plans and staying with Paul, but instead of the promised surprise, she would end up spending an evening in front of the TV or going to a cafe. Initially, Brenda didn't question whether Paul really had prepared something for her exactly when she had planned to meet with her friends, or if it was just ordinary manipulation to make her stay home with him. When such a coincidence happened once again, Brenda decided to talk to her man and explain that while he was important to her, it didn't mean she would stop communicating with everyone else. However, instead of constructive dialogue, Paul accused her of being callous, said she had ruined his surprise and mood, reproached her for not appreciating him and constantly destroying everything good between them, then took offense and simply stopped talking. Instead of noticing the obvious manipulation, Brenda began to examine herself, wondering if perhaps she really was doing something wrong. After all, Paul was the man she wanted to marry. She had even moved to the big city to meet him, and now was reproaching her beloved just because he wanted to be close to her. Somewhere deep inside, a tiny doubt was stirring, but Brenda tried not to notice it. During the following months, the woman never mentioned meeting friends again, and everything seemed fine in their relationship, at least that's how it appeared. In reality, Paul began controlling Brenda more and more. Once he reproached her for spending too much time talking with her family instead of spending time with him. Brenda started calling less frequently until her connection with relatives completely ceased. Gradually, her wardrobe changed because Paul disliked certain clothes. If she tried to protest, he would take offense and assure her that he was only doing this so that his woman would appeal to him. Paul noticeably became anxious if Brenda didn't conform to his opinions. Then the man declared that he didn't like makeup and that his chosen one would look much younger and sweeter if she didn't use cosmetics. To please her boyfriend, Brenda gave up makeup, although she felt very uncomfortable and sensed as if she was losing her own identity. But then she would immediately convince herself that she wanted to spend the rest of her life with this man, so why not listen to his requests and preferences? The changes started with small things, like makeup and clothes, and ended with Brenda compromising her comfort and happiness to appease Paul. She was no longer that former cheerful and happy young woman, and realized she was losing part of her personality and becoming someone else. Not only was Brenda changing, she also noticed changes in Paul that truly frightened her. Disagreements over the most insignificant matters began arising between them more and more frequently. If previously Paul would just get upset and offended, now he started becoming physical. If Brenda disagreed with something, he might grab her by the neck or arms and shake her thoroughly. It all began with a light grip, then evolved into much stronger displays of aggression. After 10 months of relationship, Paul became a completely different person, not at all who Brenda had imagined him to be before. He would get worked up over any little thing, was constantly irritated and excessively rough. During one of their arguments, Brenda asked her partner if the remaining part of their life together would look exactly like this. Instead of answering, Paul grabbed the woman by the neck and threatened that he could take her life right now. Brenda was suffocating and genuinely couldn't understand how she could have ended up in such a situation. When her beloved man's hand finally loosened, Brenda spent half the night thinking. At first, she questioned what she had done wrong that led them to this point. Maybe she had somehow provoked Paul, pushed him over the edge. But then it suddenly dawned on Brenda that this wasn't her fault at all. It was Paul who was acting crazy. Apparently, upon meeting a man who immediately appealed to her, she couldn't see his negative traits. During their life together, these traits intensified, and Paul began crossing forbidden boundaries. Whatever the case, the realization that she might one day really get hurt by her partner's hand forced Brenda to make a difficult decision. At that, the woman perfectly understood that she couldn't just leave Paul. He knew where she worked, knew where her family lived outside the city, knew all her friends, and would hardly allow her to simply pack her things and walk out the front door. Moreover, her relationships with friends had dwindled to nothing. They hadn't communicated for a long time, and Brenda didn't know who to turn to for help. Due to her future husband's disapproval, she had also distanced herself from her family, completely stopping her calls to them. She could no longer use them as her allies. Each of her days resembled the previous one. In the morning, Brenda would go to work, then return home to Paul. After that, she wouldn't talk on the phone, go outside, or browse the internet. He had even made her delete her social media accounts. At home, Paul would take away her keys and cell phone, check who she had called and messaged, and only return them in the morning when it was time to go to work again. Over the past year, the woman hadn't even noticed how she had become an involuntary prisoner of the relationship. The time from a passionate romance with a tall, attractive man to voluntary captivity beside an aggressive monster had passed unnoticed. Their intimate life had also undergone changes. If previously everything happened by mutual consent, now Paul could pounce on Brenda at the most unexpected moment. The woman was frightened that during such sudden attacks, her partner became more aroused. It excited him when his partner resisted, and he forced her into intercourse. At first, Brenda tried to fight, but then realized it was easier to surrender and do what was demanded of her. Usually, the next day, Paul would wake up in a good mood and pretend nothing terrible had happened. It was the same this time. In the morning, Paul decided to do some housework and fix the kitchen faucet. He laid out his tools and crawled under the sink. When Brenda entered the kitchen and saw the heavy wrench on the floor, a terrible thought flashed through her mind. What if she quietly took the tool, waited until Paul's head appeared from under the sink, and struck with all her might? Then she would instantly be free from his power and control. At that moment, the woman was fed up with the constant humiliation. Brenda didn't think about what would happen to her afterward. She just wanted to be free from the oppression. Fortunately, at that moment, there was a knock at the door. Paul looked out and saw his fiancée's strange, frozen stare. He sighed reproachfully and told her not to stand like a statue, but to see who had come. Brenda emerged from her dark thoughts and headed to the door. It was their landlady, who had stopped by for some matter. The women went down to the street, and Brenda, unexpectedly even to herself, poured out all her problems to the owner. She broke down crying and told about everything that had been troubling her for the past few months. Brenda confessed her fear of her partner and asked for help. The apartment owner comforted her and called the police. Law enforcement officers arrived very quickly. They arrested Paul and took him to the station. Brenda felt relief and was already rejoicing that her nightmare would soon end and everything would be behind her. She knew she hadn't seen Paul for the last time in her life. However, she didn't expect him to be released the very next day. Brenda was driving her car when she saw Paul's truck in the rearview mirror. He appeared literally out of nowhere and began approaching at high speed, wanting to frighten the woman. Brenda hadn't expected to meet Paul on the road, so she was very scared. Pulling up to a stop sign, she decided to use the opportunity to call the police. Paul, meanwhile, pulled up in his vehicle on the left side and lowered his window. He didn't say a word, just smirked, making a sinister grimace. At that moment, Brenda understood that this was a warning and she shouldn't return to their shared home. The best thing she could do was go to the police and get a restraining order, which she did. Paul didn't return to spend the night at their shared home, but he had keys, so Brenda didn't feel safe. She decided to move out quickly and stay with one of her former friends. The frightened woman didn't want to take anything large with her, so she put her furniture up for sale online and began packing her other belongings. After spending a couple of nights at her friend's place, Brenda returned to their shared home with Paul to get her bags. She had grown somewhat bolder since Paul hadn't shown up either at home or at her workplace during these days. He hadn't even called once or sent any messages, which also gave her confidence. Exhausted from cleaning and packing, Brenda didn't notice how she fell asleep. The next day, at exactly 8 a.m., she received a message about the couch she had put up for sale. While Brenda was writing a reply message, her phone rang. She answered, but there was a strange, frightening silence. The woman was about to disconnect when she heard Paul's whisper saying that he loved her. Then some noise came from outside. Brenda approached the window and wanted to look outside. At that moment, the front door began to crack. It was Paul, trying to break in, and soon he succeeded. Brenda wanted to run away and hide, but the man quickly caught up with her. He dragged her outside and forcefully put her in his truck in the passenger seat. Then he locked the doors and began banging his head against the steering wheel again and again with all his might, like a maniac. After this, Paul started the engine and drove in an unknown direction, taking Brenda with him. They drove for a long time. The woman felt she had one last chance to somehow change the situation and tried to talk to Paul. She said she still loved him, and together they could try to bring everything back and become a happy couple again. But the man didn't utter a word during all 3 hours of the journey. The vehicle stopped at an empty house belonging to Paul's family. The house was located in an isolated area, and there was absolutely no one around. Brenda understood that if Paul intended to harm her, no one would look for her in this wilderness. She didn't know what Paul was thinking, so she took desperate measures and initiated intimate relations with him. Brenda hoped this way to relax him and then try to escape, and it seemed this actually calmed the man somewhat. But he still didn't say a word and remained very detached. Brenda had never seen Paul like this before, so she didn't know what to expect. His next action caused bewilderment. Paul took out his phone and called his grandmother, asking her to come to this empty house. Brenda still didn't understand what he had planned, but hoped that the arrival of the woman who raised him would save her own life. Then for 2 hours, they just sat together and waited for Paul's grandmother to arrive. 2 hours of tension and fear seemed like an eternity to Brenda. When the elderly woman finally entered the house, Brenda noticed 2 firearms in Paul's hands. For the grandmother, such behavior from her grandson apparently wasn't new. She carefully approached him and asked him to give her the gun and not do anything foolish. Paul obeyed, but the second gun still remained with him. At this time, his mobile phone rang. The call was from Paul's friend, who informed him that the police were looking for Paul in connection with Brenda Becks' disappearance. The thing was, that day the woman was supposed to be at work. When she didn't show up on time, a colleague who knew her story called the police and asked them to check Paul and Brenda's house. She told the officers about the restraining order and expressed her concerns about Brenda's absence. This call sent Paul into a rage. His state became unstable again. Anger and fury overtook him. He raised the gun that remained with him and pointed it directly at Brenda. The woman, not knowing how else to preserve her life, began pleading with Paul not to commit thoughtless actions. She swore she would call the police and say that no one had kidnapped her, promised to drop all charges and cancel the restraining order against Paul, begged him to remember how happy they were and try to bring it all back. Apparently, Paul didn't want to end up in jail, so he handed Brenda the phone and demanded that she call the police station right now. She actually had to explain herself to the dispatcher, lie that she had simply forgotten to warn work that she would take a day off, and ask them to stop searching for her. In reality, Brenda understood that the police might simply not make it in time to save her. At that moment, she had no choice but to make up a story on the spot. But in her soul, the woman prayed to God that the operator wouldn't believe her story, and apparently, God heard her. The dispatcher transferred the call to one of the detectives, who said they would stop the search, but Brenda needed to come to the police station immediately and confirm what she said in person, write a statement, and clarify the situation. Paul heard the entire conversation and didn't suspect anything, so Brenda and his grandmother began convincing him that they would go to the police together and sort everything out. Both women assured the man that everything would be fine, they would get back together and live happily, and then have a wedding. At that moment, Brenda was ready to promise Paul anything just to escape captivity, and this tactic worked. But as soon as Brenda arrived at the sheriff's office, she told the whole truth about her kidnapping. A tactical team was dispatched to Paul's family's empty house. Paul wasn't entirely sure that Brenda would actually return and everything would be fine, so as soon as she left with his grandmother, the man called his biological mother and asked her to come. And now the mother tried to calm him down and prevent him from doing anything foolish. Soon after Paul's mother, the police arrived at the house. Paul responded to their demand to come out with a categorical refusal. He threatened to kill himself if they didn't leave him alone. Law enforcement officers talked to him through the loudspeaker system. Inside, his mother was with him and tried in every way to convince her son to surrender. But none of this helped. Paul had no intention of going outside and shouted that they wouldn't take him alive. Not today or any other day. Suddenly there was a loud bang, and a few moments later Paul's mother ran out of the house screaming because her son had shot himself in front of her. Learning about the sad ending of her story and love, Brenda felt very bad. She didn't want everything to end this way. But over time, the woman realized that she herself could have become a victim of her partner. And now, he had made such a terrible choice only because he didn't want to answer for his actions. A year of relationship that began with a happy meeting ended in a senseless tragedy that could have been avoided. Building healthy relationships with a partner is always work and requires effort from both sides. But sometimes one of the pair strives to completely control the other's life. Usually, psychological problems lie behind this, and the person tries to solve them at the expense of other people. This is the end of the story. Like the video and leave your thoughts in the comments. This was Jeremy. See you soon.